Hello, everyone. This is Portfolio Room podcast. My name is Gleb Ismailov. I'm private equity CFO specialist in Privatel, and this is Portfolio Room podcast. Today on the show, we have Gijsbert De Zoeten, CFO of PLC, X1, and he will tell about how to transition the role of the CFO in private equity company from a listed company. Gijsbert, nice to see you today.
Yeah, thank you, Glab, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A bit about myself. After a 25 years career in Unilever, where I worked in Brazil and Europe and ended as a CFO for Europe, I transitioned to private equity-backed business called LeasePlan, car leasing, where I worked for a while. And after that, I worked as a public CFO for Inchcape, a global automotive distributor based in London. So I've worked in both a public and a private equity-backed space. I'm a business-driven CFO. I have a lot of experience with transformation. I love to work in teams, and I really like to develop talent. That's a bit about me.
I see it. Yeah, that's the reason why I wanted to speak with you today. Could you please tell, so you had experience working in a listed company and also private equity backed company. What are the main differences?
I think when you in private equity, there is always a transformation plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a lot of sense because private equity buy a business with a strategic intent, and then it needs management to develop a plan, to get there. So there is always a transformation plan. Secondly, I think private equity think in quarters, which I think is super helpful. There is always a timeline. Quarters help you to measure progress. It helps you also to keep the pace. And contrary to what many people think, quarters are not distracting you from the longer term. In fact, in a public company, sometimes you have to please your investors with a certain quarter. You do not have that in private equity. You can just think about the longer term. You can just think about getting there faster. So that quarter thinking is something that I found quite characteristic. Then thirdly, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of focus on cash. I mean, cash clearly has not been that expensive recently. So maybe in public companies generally, the focus in business has not been too much on cash. But today it's clear that with the costs coming back, it's absolutely critical. But it is much deeper ingrained in the thinking of private equity companies for obvious reasons. And as we all know, cash doesn't lie, right? So I think that is super powerful. And then fourth, I think the participation of management in success, and that can be much broader than in a public company, is equally helpful. I mean, you can have a simple and powerful concept like thinking in multiples, so that people at every level in the organization understand how do you contribute to the bigger success of the company. Mm. But if you take it from the other end, having just worked 3.5 years in a public company after my private equity experience, you can see how much time is spent on governance and on complex stakeholder relationships, right? Mm-hmm. Clearly, boards very much take the governance lens. There's lots of things you do, like meeting investors every quarter, that just take a lot of time that you could also spend on getting your business better. Now, I think it's useful experience to have because at some point you will have to exit your private equity journey into public or in peer-to-peer or whatever. But it is a key difference that a lot of time is spent on, you could argue, less productive stuff. Mm. Lastly, and then I'll get back to you, I think there is just more co-creation with the private equity fund behind you. If you take it from a public space, it's normally management that develops a strategy and the board that needs to approve the strategy. The roles in private equity between management and private equity firm are, of course, more blurred. And I think there is more co-creation, which I think is helpful. Normally they know also a lot about industry. Of course, there is a usual tension, and you need to balance it in the right way. But I think it's a key difference.
I see. And I guess because as well of the, as you mentioned, management incentive, it's more like motivational to work in private equity backed company. And also, as you mentioned correctly, that because you don't have to do a roadshow every quarter or every month, it's kind of, you save lots of time, essentially. Like you can get, roll your sleeves up and get to the bottom of the problem and improve the company. And this leads also us to A second question: do you think, like, how often do you think a private equity house should interact with the portfolio company? Is it what's better, like very often, or actually better to give space to the portfolio company and let's say like don't meet like every week, but rather like every month, with the management, with the C level?
Yeah. No, I think there's a bit of a sequence here. I think it's very important that there is alignment on the strategy and the long-term plan between the portfolio company and the private equity. So you actually should spend a lot of time making sure that you are aligned on that. And then you can define a set of parameters and give space to management to operate. So then I'm more in your camp of, let's say, once a month or perhaps some weekly calls on specific subjects, but you have to give space to management. And I think what also helps, so the clarity on the longer term helps, but what also clearly helps is the trust. And one of the things is bad news needs to travel fast, right? Mm-hmm. And I think if private equity owners see that you also give them the bad news, is just one way of building the trust. So I think trust will also help to give more space to management. Mm-hmm. But you have to give management time, the space to operate. I mean, in a way, you can argue. I should be careful here, but private equity are great investors,
yeah, of course,
but not always great operators.
Yep, that's what I also find from my experience when talking with people like you, that it's either they give too much space and you can't really like you have basically to knock the door and wait for a long time to speak with them, or they're too much there. It's like they take too much space because they essentially C-level it's good to hear the opinion from the private equity house, but if they're too operational, it also kind of distracts like the growth. So there should be like a sort of a middle balance.
Yeah, but I think, Gleb, as a CFO, you are in a key position to define the pace of the company in terms of management information, in terms of setting up your control cycle, if you like. And I think I've not found issues doing that, to be frank, but you should clearly define it.
Cool. Makes sense. And also, when the private equity house acquires the company in the investment cycle, what do you think are the three most important things to start in the first 100 days once you're being owned by a private equity house?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, but it comes back to a little bit what I said. Mm-hmm. I think clarity on the business vision, right, and a clear operational plan how to get there with milestones is number one. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is, how do you get there? So you have to go around the business, I think, and speak to a lot of people. And one of my mantras is respect the past, be brutal about the present, and then be bloody ambitious about the future. Mm-hmm. And most people agree on number 2 and number 3, but they do not spend, in my view, sometimes sufficient time to understand why the company is where it is. It's not like previous management were always doing the wrong things. It can just be that the circumstances were different, etc., etc. So that, and it's also more positive to the ones that are in the company, that you just don't come in and say, I think we should go, we should go this way. So that respecting the past is important, but equally be super brutal about what you find and ambitious about the future. So that's number 1. Mm-hmm. Number 2, I think, is assessing the quality of talent. Determine, who's on the bus, who is off the bus, right? Are there capability gaps, critical roles, management roles? How are they filled? And do that really early on. That talent assessment, it's so important for the later success. Thirdly, the financial plan. I don't think we need to talk about that too much more, and the cash flows and so on. And then I think also in the first 100 days, because there's a lot of nervousness in the organization. Yep. It is important to get that clarity and then to get the organization behind that plan and get them, frankly, enthusiastic about that plan, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to happen, maybe not particularly in 100 days, but relatively quickly. And lastly, take pain early. Mm-hmm. First losses are best losses. So do difficult stuff up front, but at the same time balance that with some things that will be a success. So ensure early success as well. Mm.
Yep, I see. And you mentioned the correct point, but that for the CFO it's as well important to take the lead and explain how to get from A to B, because the thing is, which I find as well, that quite often is that because the CFO leads the finance function, essentially, that sometimes there is a lack of understanding between the team. Like that's where it brings us to another topic, the connection, because, the many CFOs just say, look, this is where we need to get, but no one explains how to get there. And as you said, it's important to get the steps. And even if you go through mistakes, quickly learn and get to the aim, essentially. And that's where that brings us, I want to say about talent issues, because what challenges are you seeing? You mentioned briefly, but what are challenges you're seeing, and what impact it has done on your operations? Because essentially, we can see that in European private equity market, it's more and more difficult to find a good talent, especially in finance operations.
Yeah. No, before I go there, just to say, I mean, in terms of, I'm almost taking it for granted, but I'm as a CFO, you are at the center of this, right? And you may think that I'm talking almost like a CEO, or I could say the same with the CEO saying, but I think it is important that a CEO and a CFO are joined at the hip.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is at the heart of the success of any private equity transformation. Clearly, that the team works, but in particular, the relationship between the CFO and the CEO is super important. And I think it helps clearly if you are a business-driven CFO and have that true interest in the business, because that gets you into that how question club that you talked about. But back to talent, I think talent is a huge issue. Talent is scarce, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
It is. You will need to attract it, and you will need to coach and develop people.
Mm-hmm.
And so your visible leadership in that regard and the interest that you take in people is super important. And so on an operational thing, it's also raise the floor and raise the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
So don't tolerate certain performance. People will see that and say, okay. And you get sometimes people already leaving on that basis. But more positively, if you raise the ceiling and promote people that are doing really well, that will inspire others and will think, okay, there is a career for me here, and it sends a very clear message. So, and it is just a big part of your job.
Mm-hmm.
And we've spoken about it before, but I have clearly also learned, and it's not talk about yourself so much, but you need speed also in the recruitment process, right? It's just, if you have a very lengthy recruitment process, it's just not helpful.
Yeah.
So you need to speed up recruitment and maybe takes a bit more risk with people. But that is also what people like. So I think it is a huge topic. As I said, it's a number 2 thing that you have to do, in my view, in private equity transformation. But it's also down to you. They come to work for you ultimately, right?
Yep.
So if they can identify with the leaders, that is super attractive. And you need to build a little bit of a reputation as you go. But no other golden bullets, unfortunately, to solve it.
I understand you, especially when you mentioned about the bond and it's the match and the lengthy recruitment process. It's really important to structure the talent process and to find the right match. And also just a bit expand on the topic, which I think will be very beneficial for our audience as well, about remote and hybrid working, because we're speaking about talent right now. Now it seems like COVID times are past in the past, and everyone seems to go back to the office. How do you think, especially for the finance function, how important is it to be together in one office, or like it's fine to have a balance between hybrid and being in the office and remote?
Yeah, look, it's interesting how perspectives have changed. So I believe in a mix.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely believe in being in the office,
Mm-hmm.
because the productivity, the learning from each other, the teaming, the famous coffee machine conversation, etc. You cannot plan those, right? There is just no way around it. And then there is the magical human interaction. I mean, we're talking now over a screen. It's nice, Gleb, but it's much nicer to be in the same room together.
Yep.
There's something is happening there. And what I find interesting is that we start now from, it's all remote working. Let's see how often I come into the office. Whilst 3 years ago, it was completely all the way around. Can perhaps I work one day from home? So my mantra would be to start from that other side, to sort of say, but have a real balance, to have a nucleus in the office, and also clearly some flexibility in working. And I think what is really good is that technology allows you to do that. And I think you can find a much better balance between office and home than I had in my first 25 years of working. So I'm jealous of the new generation that can have a healthier balance. But at the same time, particularly for younger people, they learn so much from seeing other people working, right, and interacting with them, rather than having a meeting or a bloody Teams call or this or that or the other. So that is how I think about it. And that is, frankly, when I speak to people, I think there is a much more nuanced picture now in relation to this.
I agree with you in that sense as well, that, external like attributes play a big part. When I as well just, started my career, it was really important to see how other people work so that you can learn quicker. And also, I think the balance plays a key part as well, because sometimes, when you work all the time in the office, sometimes it's nice to have a, let's say, Friday or Thursday, one day during the week to just work at home so you can see the contrast, what's to appreciate the office culture. Cool. And also, the question, want also to ask, with your experience as CFO, what do you think that, if the CFO works in a 20 million EBITDA company and he has done there for years, do you think the CFO will have the same effect in a 300 million EBITDA company?
Yeah, look, it's a real big step change from 20 million to 300 million.
Yeah.
So I think it helps when you have seen bigger and when you have seen different and when you have, different experiences. So I think when you want, if you're certain that you want to make a transformation from 20 to 300, I think there is a case to be made to put in a more experienced manager that has seen bigger and has seen different, that can then help guide the organization through that process, right? There's many films you've seen, you know what's happening, you're not surprised. Clearly, you need to, if you take it from the other end, if you're coming from bigger, and I can testify to that, coming from Unilever, even into LeasePlan was a bit smaller, and Inchcape, similar size, although still quite sizable companies. You need to be willing to roll up your sleeves, right? You cannot rely on a huge mothership with all those bloody departments, etc. So there is not everyone from a big company is able to lead a small company, but I think it does help if you know where you're going and if you know what it takes to lead a bigger company. So it's I think the key differences are down to leadership. They are also down to, in many cases, and it's an awful saying, but strategic thinking, right? Can you really? Can be a very good operator. Management is about zooming in and zooming out, in my view, and the zooming in part will be perfect with someone who's run that company for a long time, 20, 30 million. But the zooming out part, so there's the strategic thinking, how you get to a step change, I think is sometimes helpful if you can accelerate that by having a good mix, by the way, of people who work in bigger companies and in smaller companies.
I see. So, okay, makes sense. So they're like, you think that should be in a structured way, like, slowly, like, for example, if you work on 20 million, it's probably better to work then like in a 30 and then slightly increase. That's probably the key in that sense, to gradually.
Look, there are of course different industries, Gleb. I mean, there are industries that grow like hell, right? Where this is a slightly different debate. But even then I think so. The growth mindset of some of the smaller companies is absolutely fantastic, and you should keep it. But there are growing pains, if you like, that need to be helped. That is very true in the finance space. In many cases, with boring stuff like controls and management information and and the whole shebang that you forecasting, whatever, IT, security. There's all sort of hygiene that needs to be there. But equally, leadership development. How do you recruit for much bigger companies? How do you just manage much bigger companies? If you have never seen that, I think it's not to say that you can't do it, but I think you can help the process by having a nice mix of people who've seen it, and then at the same time keep the people who know all about the business and have the passion.
Yep, makes sense. And Gijsbert, just finally wanted to ask your opinion in terms of I think all of us see the Financial Times news that there is economic recession coming, and it's already there with increasing inflation rates in European market. In the times of economic recession, how would you prepare the company, and how do you usually prepare the company for an exit in such conditions? I think that the question will be very relevant to our audience.
Investors. Yeah, no, look, I mean, timing of an exit is famously always difficult. And I can testify to that when I worked for LeasePlan on the IPO. And in the end, we withdrew the IPO 7 days ahead of the planned IPO date. Quite a traumatic experience, but it was just very adverse market conditions back in 2018. You would perhaps laugh about it today, but that's how we felt about it in 2018. So timing is always complicated of any exit. At the same time, it's my experience that investors will always ask the question about how did this company fare through an economic recession? How did it do through an economic recession? They will always look at that resilience. So I think, looking back how your portfolio company performed during previous, economic recessions, I think is super helpful to sort of calm down the mind of your investors to say, well, this is what we did there and then. And this is how we, let's say, came through it, survived it, etc., etc. And at the same time, if you present your short-term outlook, you just need to be showing to people that you take account of the circumstances, that you're prudent managers. Valuations are not based on the first 12 months. They are based on where they think a company can get to. Yep. So as long as you can sort of say, look, it's now going to be difficult. You need to be clear, by the way, why you choose to go, but there could be all sorts of reasons. But if you have a prudent plan with buffers that you can actually beat the plan, right? Yep. I think people appreciate that. Investors see right through all those pie-in-the-sky plans. But at the same time, you should keep on telling them how beautiful it will be when let's say, the economy comes back a bit. I think it is that balance that works. But clearly, it's more difficult, generally speaking, in a recession environment when the mindset of people is risk off versus a booming. Although we all know that after booming periods, there is always coming a more difficult period. But I think that's a bit the art of doing it, Gleb.
I see. Yeah, I think at that time, specifically that now lots of restructuring experiences needed. When we spoke with you first time conversation, we had and especially those people who've been through hard times and low times. I think those are the type of people will succeed, will prosper in this time, because essentially I'm sure that this recession will end, and that it'll be a booming period.
Yeah, Gleb, you're completely right. I think the question I would ask any manager these days, how did you manage through COVID, right?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
If you take my Inchcape period, 24 out of the 32 countries at some point were just closed, right? And it was a relatively high fixed cost business, so you decide immediately, relatively quickly, to take out a substantial part of cost.
Yeah.
Do a few things that perhaps you would have done anyway, but you now almost use that as an excuse. Now that's, I think, is a very dramatic, and I hope you'll never in the near future see such a dramatic distortion to businesses. But I think it's a very good exam question to say, what did you do through COVID? And many companies actually used it to reinvent themselves, and others did some milder restructuring and etc. etc. So I think the world has been tested recently, quite dramatically.
Yep.
Anyway, just a side comment.
I agree with you. You mentioned it correctly that it's a good exam question for finance function, especially like, okay, I know you've been through good times, you work, but tell me how you coped with the COVID times. I think that's a very good question. Gijsbert, I knew that this discussion will be filled with forward thinking and wisdom and great stories, and it totally blown my expectations. I have to say, I really wanted to thank you for stopping by in our show today in Portfolio Room Podcast. I think our audience will get a lot from this tremendous education, as did I, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gleb.
Sure.
Thank everyone.